Russian people increasingly are tired of this war, and more mothers are concerned that their sons are going to get sucked into this meat grinder in Ukraine. I think the problem is, though, whether or not he can sell it to the FSB, the people that are the kingmakers, the intelligence services that basically empowers him, as well as to the people that know that he's wrecked the economy. And for them, admitting basically defeat, that he didn't get his mythical version of Kiev and Rusk all the way to Kiev, or he didn't achieve his strategic goal of seizing Odessa as well to control all of the Black Sea. I mean, there's a lot from that inner Kremlin structure standpoint that he's going to be seen as a failure. And he may view in a maximalist way that he as a dictator can't allow that. He can't allow to be seen as weak amongst his peers. I think, that would be more motivating to him than necessarily what the Russian people themselves think. He's willing to sacrifice Russian citizens. That's clear. I think it's what his calculus will come down to, whether or not he thinks his regime can survive or not. I suspect he thinks it can't.
Joining us today, Colin Sweet, retired U.S. Army Colonel, Mark Toth, Foreign Affairs Analyst. Welcome to our program.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks for having us back on the show.
Daniel, great to be here. Thank you.
Let's begin our session with breaking news. Ukrainian government had agreed with U.S.-led peace plan on ending the war in Ukraine. According to CBS News, we don't know the language and wording yet agreed in this agreement. Mark, I would like to begin with a question to you. What is your assessment of this ongoing effort to end the war in Ukraine and recent news on recent progress made during these negotiations? How close we are to ending this bloody war against Ukraine?
Yeah, Daniel, it's a great question, and obviously we only know what we know at this point. I do feel like President Zelenskyy only had one choice here. He had to try to find a way to work with the Trump administration so as not to alienate the military aid and the intel that's coming from the U.S. That the Ukrainian army so desperately needs. Thankfully, it appears over the last 24 hours, Zelenskyy found a partner in Rubio through Yermak, through Budanov now, as we speak, meeting in the United Arab Emirates with Dan Driscoll, the U.S. Army Secretary. He found a way to push back on some of these different points that were basically no starters, if you will, for Ukraine, and frankly, no brainer as well if your country wants to survive. Most notably, that is, as reported by the New York Post, is that there's no longer this determination that Ukraine has to give up the Donbass, and in particular that fortress belt that is so critical to your defense of the plains of your country right into Kiev. So that's all encouraging. Now, since that has been the maximalist position of Putin since day one, is that he wants all of the Donbass, and frankly, we all know he wants all of Ukraine. I believe that's going to be a non-starter for Putin, even though he might dance around it for a while. But I think this war continues, and sadly, I don't think, I could be wrong, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think we're any closer to the end of this war yet.
And Colin Sweet, what is your take on this and your military assessment of the main terms which we have seen in U.S.-led this effort to end the war, U.S. draft agreement, and also the recent one, also European proposal on this?
Yeah, so first, I think everything that Mark said, I agree with. The only sticking point I really have is an expression we have in the States of want it bad, get it bad. And I think this started off as want it bad, won by the United States, and then trying to push it down upon Ukraine. Ukraine pushed back along with Europe on issues, issues pertaining to the Donbass, on issues pertaining to the strength of the military, issues pertaining to restitution, and other points. So for that perspective, there's still work to be done. But as Mark said, it's a framework. It's not a peace deal. It is a counter proposal to Russia. And quite frankly, I believe, as Mark has said, that Russia is going to take issues with some of the points that have been brought back to them. We've already heard Lavrov say this morning that Russia has received the plan, that we're reviewing it, but there are some words that need to be worked on, which means they'll take a few days to review it. And in the meantime, we're going to see more attacks like we saw last night in Kharkiv and also Odessa on residential neighborhoods in the energy infrastructure in order to pressure Ukraine to accept the deal. But as Mark said, more to follow. We'll just have to wait to see how this plays out.
I would like also to focus on the main possible terms of the deal and also this cap on the size of the Ukrainian army. The initial proposal was to reduce Ukrainian army to 600,000 soldiers. European allies propose another option to have this cap up to 800,000 troops. Colonel Sweet, 800,000 and 600,000. What is your take on these figures, and would it be enough for Ukraine to have such army for even in case of a peacetime? Is it large, small army, and how would be this capable enough to deter Russia?
Yeah, so I think the compromise of 200,000 really comes down to whether or not NATO can have troops in Ukraine. Russia's adamant about NATO not having troops in Ukraine, so NATO's come back and said, well, if we can't have troops in Ukraine, then Ukraine needs a bigger army to defend itself. So I think that's significant. The other thing I believe is significant also is that Ukraine must be permitted to have Western technology. It must be permitted to have weapons that they can defend themselves with. That means, the fighter aircraft. That means air defense systems. That means, precision deep strike weapon capabilities and drones. It's all about deterrence and getting Russia to stop attacking and not continue to be attacked, understanding that they can be, that Ukraine can retaliate. And that's always been the point, is deterrence. But you can't fight a war on deterrence. You have to have the ability to strike back. And given Ukraine the ability to have 800,000 certainly provides some additional, if you will, leverage for Ukraine. But again, I think that's all designed to offset the restriction on NATO troops in the country.
Let's also cover a recent publication by the Washington Post. This morning, Russia is unlikely to accept changes that US and Ukraine are negotiating over in the new peace plan to end the war, according to the Analyst, also who expressed their opinions, takes in interviews with the Washington Post. Mark, do you feel also such way? Do you have the reading that Russia won't accept that?
Yeah, Daniel, I do. Look, if we step back and we see how this deal started to come about, it was basically because Russia felt through Dmitriev, Putin's key ally in the Kremlin, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, is that he thought he could get everything that he wanted. There's been this false premise out there that Ukraine necessarily will lose the Donbass, and that's driven a lot of Trump's thinking, a lot of the calculus for people around him that want to get out of this war in Ukraine and focus on China. But again, it's a false promise. You don't just have to believe me or John. You can look to the Institute for the Study of War. They've been of late making, hammering this point away that by no means is the loss of the Donbass a foregone conclusion. At this point, Ukraine remains very much in control of that key fortress belt and is likely to do so. So at this point in time, I think because of the way this rolled out, because Russia thinks they're going to get everything they want, if we look at the tweets coming from Kirill Dmitriev, which, as you know, John and I had a run-in with him in terms of him being upset with us outing him in terms of trying to undermine the conservative right, as well as, stick his fingers into this peace deal in between military advisors that best know it from Trump, that they're going to continue to do these maximalist demands. So that would be my best, read of it. I'd be shocked. And if you, one quick other point here, if you really look at the Russian position here, if we look at Minsk, if we look at Budapest, there is no reason to think that Russia really believes that they're going to stop after this peace. And so I think it's critical that the European side especially, but also the U.S. say, look, we're not going to agree to these caps of 800,000 in the military. We're not going to agree to munitions or weapons caps or the types. I mean, Ukraine, in effect, even if this peace deal happens, has to prepare as though a third invasion is going to happen. And that means accumulating all of the military assets, needs, capabilities, training of soldiers, et cetera, that you didn't have this time around to prevent it from happening in the first place. You can't set yourself up for a third invasion, which I believe would be likely to come no matter what Putin may end up ultimately agreeing to here.
Hey, Daniel, can I add one point to what Mark just said?
Sure.
And what I like to say, I know we've spoken about this before, but I think when you look back on this 28-point plan that Russia provided, depending upon who you want to believe, that was their compromise. Okay, that was their compromise document that they provided to the United States and that the United States provided to Ukraine. So we're already at their compromise. And if you read all 28 points, there was some compromise, but it was still not in the areas that Ukraine, red lines are, war crime prosecution, restitution, the settling the Donbass, whether or not they can join NATO. Those are all decisions that Russia was trying to impose upon Ukraine and NATO. And Europe did come back with a proposal. I saw the 19-point proposal on Sunday, which softened the tone. But at the end of the day, when you look at both proposals, there are a lot of unfinished issues that are not in that particular document that could very well cause the peace deal to collapse within days or weeks.
Mark, don't you think that this would be irrational for Vladimir Putin to decline this offer? He won't be getting any kind of better terms in the future. He would have to sacrifice another million soldiers to at least to try to capture the whole Donbass, and his economy couldn't be look better in the future. He would have also significant problems with the economy if he continues this war. Also, moreover, US would probably impose another crippling sanctions against Putin's regime and his wartime economy. What is your take on that? Do you feel that this is so irrational to decline such generous offer from Ukraine and US?
Yeah, Daniel, that's a question I think that ultimately will depend on what changes Ukraine was able to effect in these key points about the size of your military, about who controls the Fortress Belt and Donbass, et cetera. You would think, right, after killing or wounding 1 million of his own troops in this war and damaging an economy to the extent that he has, you would think that being pushed to the brink like that he would. But I doubt that he does. And if he does, there's two caveats here. One is if he does accept this, it's only a pause for him. Nobody should be fooling themselves into thinking that this would be anything permanent. And that's why it's so important that Ukraine and Europe hold out for the best possible position if this thing restarts in 3 to 5 years, even 10 after this supposedly expires in terms of the security guarantees. And in my opinion, as a quick aside, those shouldn't. The other caveat, though, is if Putin is indeed at that point where he knows he's at a breaking point, I still think he's going to take a maximalist position because he doesn't want people to know that. Because if you realize that he's at a breaking point, then he realizes his hand collapses from a negotiating standpoint. So from my position here, I think Putin has no choice but to continue making this maximalist demands and rejecting this, even though it may seem counter-rational to those of us on the West. I suspect he continues this.
Sure. Just mentions that Vladimir Putin didn't have any kind of choice. He doesn't have any kind of choice but to continue this war. But why? Don't you think that he owns the main propaganda news media in Russia? He could sell this to Russian people. Even such a deal made by US negotiators and also this latest offer, he could sell this to Russian if he would like to do so.
Yeah, no, I think he could sell it to the Russian public if he wanted to. It's clear based on polls, to the extent that they are reliable coming out of Russia, that the Russian people increasingly are tired of this war. And more mothers are concerned that their sons are going to get sucked into this meat grinder in Ukraine. I think the problem is, though, whether or not he can sell it to the FSB, the people that are the kingmakers, the intelligence services that basically empowers him, as well as to the people that know that he's wrecked the economy. And for them, admitting basically defeat, that he didn't get his mythical version of Kiev and Rusk all the way to Kiev, or he didn't achieve his strategic goal of seizing Odessa as well to control all of the Black Sea. I mean, there's a lot from that inner Kremlin structure standpoint that he's going to be seen as a failure. And he may view in a maximalist way that he as a dictator can't allow that. He can't allow to be seen as weak amongst his peers. I think, that would be more motivating to him than necessarily what the Russian people themselves think. He's willing to sacrifice Russian citizens. That's clear. I think it's what his calculus will come down to, whether or not he thinks his regime can survive or not. I suspect he thinks it can't.
And John, what is your take on that? Can Vladimir Putin sell this to Russian people, especially for his army, military commanders, FSB and other law enforcement agencies?
Sure. I mean, he could sell it, just like Mark said, but it's not that he can sell it, to say he doesn't want to sell it. Okay, pride and ego get in his way. Okay, he has been selling to the Russian people this narrative of Ukraine is Russia, that Ukraine is has been infiltrated with Nazis, that Ukraine is part of this NATO design, to take over Russia. So for him to come off of that, I believe would be very difficult to try to come back and say, you know what, we've achieved all of our objectives. And in some way, he could come back and say he's achieved the objectives. If you look at the 28-point plan, again, we don't know what the new proposal looks like. Part of that proposal is what? It's to have national elections within the first 100 days to get Zelenskyy out of office. It gets, if you believe the portion that no NATO admission, it gets NATO out of the equation, and it offers them an opportunity to join the European Union, which is not a threat to Russia, or at least Russia doesn't perceive them to be a threat economically. There is a military aspect to it, but not at the capability of NATO. So could he sell it? Yeah. But again, his cost calculus is not measured in human lives. His cost calculus is measured in his ability to remain in charge.
Yeah, hey, Daniel, if I could add real quickly
Sure.
here. I think the problem is that Putin believes he's winning. And Trump is giving him right now every reason to believe that he is winning by initially embracing his ideas behind this 28-point peace plan that now is being reported whittled down to 19. So, until he thinks he's losing, and as John said, his cost calculus has changed so that he realizes that he's losing, I think he sees no reason to back off.
Let's also cover another interesting topic, security guarantees, because neither of option, European-led plan, US-led plan, has option and possibility of deploying European or US troops on the ground. We were talking only about Article 5, like security guarantee for Ukraine, made by probably pledged by the United States. Can we really rely on US security guarantee without physical deployment of military assets on the ground in Ukraine? Should we trust Trump's word, right? Because this is not about legal obligations. This is only political obligation, and probably just Trump's post on social media. That's how this deal could look like in reality.
Yeah, I'll start off, and I'll let Mark finish up, because he's got a lot of good points in this. Look, Ukraine's learned one thing from the Budapest Memorandum, right, is that security guarantees aren't necessarily guarantees if they're not legally binding, tied into a treaty, okay? And it's always been a backdoor to get out of maintaining your obligation to a guarantee. They're looking for a guarantee, not NATO-like guarantees, because quite frankly, the only thing in my mind that prevents Russia from invading Ukraine after a ceasefire is the physical presence of NATO soldiers on the ground, because that means that they would have to confront them and shoot them, and that means that there would be a war. If those forces are on the other side of the Ukrainian border, then you have to have governments come together to vote on whether or not they're going to live up to their obligation, and the amount of time that takes could be the time at which Russia could overrun Ukraine. So those security guarantees, Ukraine's looking for something a little more. They're looking for something in the realm of a no-fly zone that prevents Russian aircraft and drones from entering their airspace. They're looking for a no-kidding type of deterrence, ATACMS, precision deep strike weapon systems that can stop an invasion. They're looking for intelligence that can gather information on whether or not Russia is intending to attack and where. So it is critical that they get a legally binding treaty, which means countries are going to have to vote on the treaty before they sign to it. And right now, I'm not sure that President Trump has the votes in a Republican Congress. There's been a lot of blowback from the Republicans on this particular 28-point plan, and it would be a tough deal for him to sell to Congress.
And Mark, could you please continue? And also, I just wanted to add that probably U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has leaked this plan to Republican lawmakers, maybe just to increase pressure on the White House to change the terms of the deal. Don't you think so? Because Marco Rubio has been playing an important role in that, in changing the tone, attitude of these negotiations.
Yeah, starting with Rubio, it's clear that he appears, based on all the reporting that's out there, whether you look to Axios, whether you look to the New York Post, that he was blindsided by this, that he didn't, he may have had some general knowledge of it, but what basically Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and Steve Witkoff, his special envoy, and Kirill Dmitriev cooked up in this Russian-owned hotel, mind you, in Miami, caught him off guard. And it's clear that he was able to claw back some of that, at least in terms of getting the Ukrainians to come on board. And as you reported at the top of this broadcast, being reported that Ukraine has accepted it in theory. The framework, that is, not a peace deal itself. So I do think it's probable that he has been, back channeling, communicating. We don't know that yet. Can't report that as fact, but I wouldn't be surprised. In terms of the only add-on that I would do with John's take on the security guarantees themselves, look, as an American, and John might want to speak to this very quickly, if we are going to be called upon to enforce some kind of Article 5-like security guarantee in Ukraine, I don't want that, A, with U.S. forces outside of Ukraine. I want them inside of Ukraine because that's a better fighting position to have. B, I don't want that forces belt gone in the Donbass because that would be like NATO giving up the Suwalki Gap to Putin and then expecting NATO forces somehow to be able to fight that war more effectively. So I think any kind of security guarantee has to take into account what the future cost of the war would be if it starts up again, and needs to make sure that NATO forces, Western forces, if you will, start from as advantageous as a starting point as they can. And so I'm going to quickly flip to John because really that's more of a military matter for him, but I doubt he'd want to defend or try to defend Ukraine from Russian attack with the Russians in control of that beltline.
Sure, John. Do you feel that U.S. troops should be deployed inside Ukraine physically with military sites and maybe another command and control on the ground?
Sure. Look, what you want to do is dictate conditions, right? You want to be the one that's dictating the conditions on the battlefield. You don't want to be the one that's placed in a position where you have to respond to what the enemy's doing. Initiative wins wars. As Patton would say, no one won a war defending anything. Okay, so once again, it comes back down to where are you going to be when the balloon goes up? And I would rather be inside Ukraine, where my ammunition stockpiles are, where I have all my pre-planned targets, where I have coordinated defensive plans. Okay, as opposed to an uncoordinated movement, the contact in which now I'm dealing with multiple countries. Even though we're fighting a NATO type of doctrine, it's still going to be a fluid situation in which I have to, one, get there, right? I have to bring forces to the battle. Then I have to maneuver into Ukraine in order to retake terrain. Well, you don't want to retake anything. You want to hold it, and then you want to push forward. So yeah, I agree with Mark. It's not a matter of wanting to be on the defensive. It's rather maintaining the initiative. And initiative is important. It's one of those key principles of war, along with speed, surprise, and mass, that you have to have in order to win.
And also, final point, Washington Post reported that U.S. officials were considering providing Ukraine with U.S.-made Tomahawk cruise missile as part of security guarantee for Ukraine to be provided to Ukraine and as a just guarantee that Ukraine can fight back in case of Russia violates this possible agreement. John, would it be enough to have just Tomahawks on the ground as a deterrent for Russia?
Look, it's a deterrent, one of many deterrents, okay? But it offers obviously more of a punch than some of the other weapon systems that have been provided to Ukraine by the United States and by NATO. But again, it's just a single weapon system that provides some additional reach and also some additional ability to strike targets that may be harder than other targets, given this ability to evade air defense systems and use terrain to mask its flight route into the country. But it would send a signal to Russia. It's one of those weapon systems that Russia is wary of, that Russia doesn't necessarily have a counter for. It sends a strong message, but the weapon by itself isn't enough. Other assets need to be involved in order to provide them a full range of military options. Mark?
Yeah, I'd quickly add that I
Sure.
think something like Tomahawks in that light is probably something that the U.S. is putting on the table more or less knowing that they're willing to concede it down the road. It's to get a concession back from the Russians. So a little bit of negotiating tack going on there. In terms of the overall picture for Ukraine, if this peace deal comes about, you want to see the ability to fight a combined arms warfare type defense and offense going forward. So Tomahawks is one piece of that, but there's a lot more that Ukraine would need in order to deter Russia from attacking again.
Thank you, Colin Sweet and Mark Toth, for your time and for joining us today, and glory to Ukraine.
Hey, thank you, Daniel. Great to be back on the show.
Thank you, Daniel, and glory to Ukraine as well. Thank you.